You might want to play them, but these are the games that never cross the ocean. RPGs built for the Super Famicom and Mega Drive that sat in Japan, while Western players were told the library had nothing left to offer. Some received fan translations, and some are still waiting. All of them represent exactly the kind of ambitious, strange, and sometimes brilliant design that made 16-bit RPGs worth caring about in the first place. Monster World 4 is the final entry in the series and the only one built around a female protagonist, with Asha, a warrior who travels with a small ghost companion. The game never left Japan during the Mega Drive era, and its absence from Western markets meant that Sega's own platformer RPG lineage effectively ended for most players before this installment existed. The little ghost companion actually is the mechanic that makes the game work beyond its genre competence. It floats alongside you, can be thrown to activate switches, absorbs wind currents to create updrafts for extended jumps, and cushions falls in ways that enable platforming sequences the game is specifically designed around. The partnership between the two characters gives the movement system a cooperative quality that single-character action RPGs from the era couldn't replicate. The visual presentation is among the best the Mega Drive produced in its final years. Expressive sprite animation, environmental variety across regions, and a color palette that used the hardware's capabilities more creatively than most late-era releases. The tone is warm, and the story is simple, which fits the platformer RPG format better than heavier narratives tend to. Sega eventually released an official localization in 2012, making it accessible without fan patches, but most players still haven't found it. Monster World 4 is a complete and generous game that deserved the audience it finally started reaching 30 years late. Metal Max Returns is a post-apocalyptic JRPG where tanks are your primary mode of combat, and the world is a wasteland full of bounty targets with names and prices on their heads. That premise alone separates it from everything else the Super Famicom library was doing in 1995, and the game commits to it completely. The bounty hunting structure gives exploration a purpose that most JRPGs of the era replaced with vague, save-the-world urgency. You're hunting specific monsters for specific rewards, and the world feels organized around that economy rather than around a linear story. Tank customization is where the depth lives. You're building loadouts from salvage parts, balancing firepower against mobility, and configuring your vehicle for specific bounty targets in ways that make preparation feel like an actual skill. The game doesn't hold your hand toward the right configurations. Figuring out that a particular bounty requires a specific weapon type through failure is part of how it teaches you the world. I found that loop more compelling than most turn-based JRPG combat systems from the same period. The tone is darkly comedic in a way that Japanese post-apocalyptic fiction often is, not grimdark, but genuinely strange and occasionally absurd about the world it's built. The story is minimal, which suits the sandbox bounty structure better than a conventional narrative would. Fan translations make it accessible now, and the Mega Drive original and its Super Famicom remake both have their advocates. This is the entry point the series deserves more recognition for. Surging Aura is a Mega Drive RPG from 1994 that sits somewhere between a traditional JRPG and an action RPG in its combat approach, and the combination was unusual enough at the time that it didn't fit neatly into how the Japanese market was categorizing its own output. The battle system uses real-time movement within a turn structure. You position your characters during a phase and then watch the combat resolve based on those positions, which creates a rhythm that's more tactically engaged than pure turn-based combat and more readable than full real-time action. The world building is where it surprised me. Surging Aura has a mythology and a cosmological structure that it reveals gradually and doesn't fully explain. Political history delivered through environmental details, faction dynamics that require paying attention to NPC dialogue across multiple towns, and a late-game reveal that recontextualizes events from the opening in ways that require the player to have actually retained information from hours earlier. The kind of trust in the player's attention was rare in 1994. The fan translation community kept it alive for English speakers, though it took years longer than higher-profile Super Famicom titles to receive attention. The Mega Drive library has always been less documented in Western fan communities than the Super Famicoms, which means games like Surging Aura exist in a smaller shadow than they should. It's not a perfect game. The encounter rate in certain dungeons tests patience, and some of the late areas repeat their own visual vocabulary too heavily. But the combat system and the world building make it worth finding. Treasures of the Ruderas, a Square game that arrived at the end of the Super Famicom's commercial life and disappeared almost immediately in 1996. What it contains is one of the most unusual structural experiments Square ever attempted. 3 parallel storylines following 3 different protagonists whose timelines are running simultaneously, covering the same 30-day countdown to the end of the world from 3 different perspectives. The stories intersect, contradict each other's accounts of events, and eventually converge in ways the individual threads don't telegraph clearly until they do. The magic system is the other thing people remember. Spells are created by combining syllables in a constructed language the game provides. You're building words from a phonetic system and discovering their effects through experimentation. It's an absurd amount of complexity to build into the Famicom. It works because the game is generous enough with a syllable system that discovery feels rewarding rather than arbitrary. I spent more time with the spell creation screen than most dedicated crafting systems in later games demanded. The translation gap meant almost no Western players engaged with it at the time, and even within Japan, it's not a well-remembered title. Fan translations have brought it to English speakers now, and what they find is a game that was genuinely experimental at a level Square wasn't publicly associated with, quieter and stranger than Final Fantasy, less celebrated than Chrono Trigger, and in some ways more interesting than either. Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War is the game that expanded what Fire Emblem was willing to be. The 4th entry in the series introduced a scale and a narrative complexity that the earlier game's smaller, more tactical focus hadn't attempted. Maps so large that each chapter plays out like a full campaign, a generational story structure where the cast of the second half are the children of the first half's characters, and a blood inheritance system where parent pairings in the first generation directly determined the stats and skills available to the second generation's units. The relationship mechanic changes everything about how you play. In most strategy RPGs, keeping units alive is about preserving tactical resources. In Genealogy, keeping specific characters alive and pairing them correctly is about shaping who their children will be and what tools you'll have access to 20 hours later. The consequences of decisions made in Chapter 3 don't fully reveal themselves until Chapter 7, and that temporal weight makes the game feel more like a novel than a tactics title. The story goes to places Fire Emblem hadn't touched before: political betrayal, genocide, generational cycles of violence. And it handles those subjects with a directness that the series has rarely matched since. The maps are enormous to the point where some players find them exhausting, and the pacing of the early game asks for patience the later chapters reward. It didn't reach the West officially until 2023's Engage-era content acknowledgements, but fan translations have made it a foundational text for serious Fire Emblem players for decades. Energy Breaker is a 1996 Super Famicom tactical RPG from Taito that almost nobody has heard of, and the reason for that obscurity isn't quality. It's the combination of late-cycle release timing, minimal marketing even within Japan, and a decade-long gap before the fan translation community got to it. What it contains is a genuinely original take on the tactics format. An isometric grid system with elemental terrain that changes during battles. A protagonist who is an amnesiac woman trying to reconstruct her own past, and a tone that sits closer to magical realism than the genre fantasy most tactical RPGs occupied. The terrain system is a mechanical hook that sets it apart. Elemental energy flows through the battlefield and can be redirected, absorbed, or detonated depending on how you position units and use abilities. Fights become puzzles about managing the energy state of the terrain rather than just deploying superior force. And the system has enough depth that the late game introduces scenarios the early game's understanding of the rules wouldn't have prepared you to solve. The story is quiet and melancholy in ways that the cheerful visual style initially conceals. The amnesia premise isn't a narrative convenience. Recovering the protagonist's memories is the emotional core of the game, and the revelations land with more weight than the format usually allows. Energy Breaker is the kind of game that a certain type of player finds once and talks about permanently. It deserved a much wider audience than it got. Front Mission Gun Hazard is the game in the Front Mission series that everyone who's played it considers the most underrated, and it is significantly different from what that franchise is known for. Where the mainline entries are turn-based strategy RPGs focused on customizable mechs on grid maps, Gun Hazard is a side-scrolling action RPG, closer in structure to Metal Warriors or Cybernator than to the tactical siblings it shares a name with. The Wanzer customization DNA from the main series survives in the loadout system, but the actual play is real-time, kinetic, and considerably more demanding mechanically. The action is precise and readable in ways that side-scrolling mech games of the era often weren't. Weapon switching mid-combat, managing cooldowns, reading enemy attack patterns from a frontal perspective. The game builds a combat vocabulary over its runtime that rewards mastery rather than just persistence. I found myself replaying earlier stages once I understood the systems better, which is a meaningful indicator of how well the controls were tuned. The story extends the Front Mission universe's military conflict setting into a narrative with more moral complexity than the premise suggests. Factions you work with turn out to have agendas that complicate the clean lines the opening establishes. Squaresoft published it internally, but never brought it west, and the fan translation that eventually arrived revealed a game that would have sold well had anyone known it existed. Gun Hazard is the best argument for why the Front Mission name deserved more than one genre. Bahamut Lagoon is a 1996 Square game that somehow never made it west despite coming from the company that was actively shipping Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger to international audiences. The strategy RPG structure crosses tactical grid combat with JRPG dragon-raising mechanics. Your dragons level up, bond with specific characters, and can be outfitted with items that affect their elemental affinities and battle behavior. The combination shouldn't feel as cohesive as it does, but Square's production values at the time were high enough to make almost anything work. The tactical layer uses terrain and positioning in ways that the more famous strategy RPGs of the era didn't fully explore. Dragons operate semi-independently in combat, which means managing them alongside your infantry units creates a dual-track decision-making process that takes a few missions to fully internalize. I kept finding interactions between dragon behavior and terrain that the game hadn't explicitly explained but had clearly designed for. The story is where it gets genuinely interesting. A war narrative with a morally complicated protagonist, political betrayals that the game earns rather than announces, and a romantic subplot handle with more nuance than Square's contemporaneous work usually managed. The localization that never came is one of the more puzzling absences in Square's Western publishing history, given how complete and polished the game is. Fan translations cover it fully now, and it plays as a finished product from start to finish. Live Alive is the game that people who know it treat it like a secret worth protecting. 7 standalone scenarios set across different time periods and genres. Prehistoric feudal Japan, the Wild West, near-future sci-fi, a kung fu training arc, a robot awakening story, and a medieval chapter that ties everything together. Each with a different protagonist, a different visual tone, and a different approach to the RPG format. Some chapters have almost no combat. Some are built around a single escalating confrontation. The variety is the point, and it works because each scenario commits fully to its own logic. The combat system uses a grid-based positioning layer that makes the physical location of characters during turn-based battles matter. Range, facing, and area effects all interact in ways that give fights a spatial dimension most contemporaries ignored. Each protagonist has a completely different skill set, which means the combat feels meaningfully different in each chapter rather than just reskin. Square remade it in HD 2D in 2022, which finally gave it the Western release it had missed for nearly 3 decades. The remake is excellent, but the original version has a specific sprite aesthetic that fits the anthology structure in ways the updated presentation softens slightly. Either way, it's one of the most structurally ambitious JRPGs ever made, and the people who played it during the fan translation era treated it with the kind of reverence that turns out, on examination, to be completely justified. Shin Megami Tensei 2 picks up in a post-apocalyptic Tokyo that's now been rebuilt as a corporate theocracy, and the setting is more pointed and more politically specific than anything the West was receiving from Atlas at the time. The law, chaos, neutral alignment system runs through every major decision, every demon you recruit, and every ending the game offers. And unlike games that attach moral choices to a single variable that slides left or right, it uses alignment to determine which factions will work with you, which areas you can access, and what the world actually is, depending on how you've navigated it. Demon negotiation and fusion are as deep here as anywhere in the series. Every encounter is a potential conversation where reading a demon's personality and responding correctly determines whether it joins you or attacks harder. Fusing demons into stronger allies using the results of those negotiations creates a progression system that rewards engagement with the encounter system rather than just grinding through it. I found myself talking to enemies I could easily kill just to see what they'd offer. The tone is uncompromising in a way that explains why Atlas considered the series unmarketable for Western game audiences at the time. Biblical symbolism, government surveillance, infrastructure treated as casual world-building detail, and endings that refuse to provide the comfort of a clean victory. It's serious in ways that 1994 JRPG localization pipelines weren't equipped to handle. Fan translations have preserved it fully, and it stands as one of the foundational works of the entire Megaten lineage.